This is Let Me Sum Up, your regular deep dive into recent reports on climate and energy. I'm Luke Menzel, back once again on Wurundjeri land, and as always, I'm joined by my two co-hosts, Global Vice President for ESG and T-shirts at the Let Me Sum Up podcast, Frankie Muscovich. Hello, Frankie.
Hello, Luke and Tennant. Delighted to be with you as always. I remain on Gadigal land, grounded as my enormous pregnant belly continues to grow, and I'm that much closer to wearing T-shirts all day, every day for a little while. It's great.
I think this will be news for some of our listeners. Frankie, you are indeed heavily pregnant.
I am. That's a thing that's happening. Clocked up 8 months today. And, it's all going to get pretty crazy in the next few weeks, but I am looking forward to wearing T-shirts more regularly for a little while, amongst other things, of course.
Tie-dyed T-shirts?
Oh, you know it.
All right, well, we'll return to that piece of news later, but I haven't introduced a man who dreams of a tempestuous Top Gun-style bromance between the Productivity Commission and an Australian carbon border adjustment mechanism. Tennant Reid. G'day, Tennant.
It's a romance written in the stars. It's a romance destined to happen. The Val Kilmer of the Productivity Commission and the Tom Cruise of CBAM.
Oh, God.
Born wingmen.
Your meme work on that was among your best. I think we better chuck a link to that in the show notes so our summer uppers can catch up with that particular intervention. But we have things to talk about. Last week, the Victorian government made headlines around Australia when it announced that from the 1st of January 2024, new homes that require a planning permit will not be allowed to connect to the gas network. The move to all-electric new homes has delighted advocates that see this as a sensible step forward in efforts to decarbonise residential heating in the state. However, the policy is not without its critics, who have expressed concerns about impacts on local manufacturers, the short time frame between the announcement and implementation, and curtailing the rights of consumers to make their own technology choices. Frankie, this was a big call from the Andrews government. Was it the right one?
Well, I would say it was, but that's very much speaking from the view of an advocate for the building sector who, I think as we've covered on previous episodes of this podcast, have been advocating for a shift to electrification on the basis that it's cheaper to run homes that are all electric, and frankly, there's not a viable alternative if the end target is net zero in a couple of decades. That's viable today, right? So did it take all of us by surprise? Sort of, in the sense that we've spoken on this podcast before about just how ambitious Victoria's new interim target at 2035 of 75 to 80% emissions reduction was, and the fact that they, to get there, they'd need to be grappling with some pretty tricky issues. And given how reliant Victoria's, particularly homes, but economy is on gas use, that was always going to feature, in the government's plan. So, a political realist would look at this and go, well, they've done it far enough ahead of the next election that, perhaps all the response will calm down in that time. But, the reality of what they've announced, which is, it's just to focus on homes. It is going to impact, new apartment buildings and mixed-use buildings that have apartments as well. But it applies to buildings that don't already have a development approval by 1 Jan next year. And that's a pretty sort of significant asterisk over it. If you know anything about the way residential land is developed at the, at the bigger sort of volume end of things, those approvals can be sought, so years in advance. And
that's the trick, and I think that got lost a little bit, right, Frankie? What the policy really is that you won't be able to get a planning permit to connect a new home to a gas network from 1st of January 2024, right?
Yeah. So look, any home or even a estate of homes, if you're thinking about larger developments where you have a lot of homes developed all together, anything that's sort of reasonably, shovel ready and getting, possibly coming out of the ground next year likely already has an approval in place. And so this announcement wouldn't really affect those projects. What it is going to do is for, be it like an individual owner looking to do a knockdown rebuild or build a new home that's starting the process of seeking approval next year, this will apply to them. But because of the timeframes, that these projects take to, sort of from go to woe, it's going to affect a modest number of projects next year, I would say, and the bigger impact obviously is as the housing stock would grow over time. But there's no kind of pipeline of projects that like thousands and thousands of homes that are like all of a sudden overnight suddenly impacted by this. That's very much not the intent of this. So it is looking at that sort of forward pipeline from next year seeking approval.
So that said, it is a very big and momentous decision. Even though you're right, it takes a little while to really phase in effectively.
Yeah.
And it is just a decision about new builds. It's not a decision to ban the sales of replacement gas appliances. It's not a decision to rip appliances out of existing houses. But it really does feel like the moment at which the Victorian government clearly and definitively signals that it thinks there's no future, not only for natural gas in residential contexts, but no future for renewable gases in the long term in resi contexts. It's electrification that they're plumping for. You could imagine a world where, maybe there's a turnaround in 10 or 20 years in the economics of home heating alternatives, and a future government makes a decision to resurrect the network or arrest it in the last phases of a death spiral or something like that. But absent that kind of long-term turnabout, this is the moment at which a bunch of possibilities collapse down to one future, which is electrification, at least as far as households go. And so it's a moment for a certain amount of angst from some quarters, and maybe a bit of celebration from others. An awful lot has got to be done to make that larger turn work, but this is a big moment.
Well, I definitely think even though the ACT has already moved along these lines to ban new gas connections, and that their ban is much more wide-ranging than this one, which only applies to new homes. But I think we will look at this as a bit of a turning point in the debate. But the government's also being a little bit coy about what it sees as the pathway for, the existing building stock and other building types over the next little while. And I think we might expect to see some more of that detail when the government looks to re-release its even more hotly anticipated, I imagine, update to the Victorian gas transition roadmap, which I think we're expecting towards the end of the year. So it's definitely signalling a turn point, but there is, there's a lot more work to be done on what that broader transition looks like for sure.
And Luke, how do you think the reception's going to this this announcement? It's been very calm, hasn't it?
What a loaded question.
My Twitter feed over the weekend was a sea of serenity, not. Yes, look, like Frankie, I was out and about on Friday expressing my organisation's support for the policy. As you've both said, on one level it's entirely uncontroversial if you take Victoria's climate targets at face value. But I do think the response, which has been, full-throated endorsement on one side of the ledger, but for many Victorians this came as a great surprise. and it generated a lot of concern and confusion. Certainly that dominated a lot of the news coverage, but not all. There was a lot of very thoughtful coverage right across the major outlets around what this meant for the longer term transition, which I was really pleased by. But it underlined a point that we made a couple of episodes, right, which is that we're at the start of a journey of the Victorian public and the Australian public more broadly, but this is a particular issue in Victoria, getting their head around this part of the energy transition. In a sense, it's all been pretty straightforward. People haven't actually had to change very much about how they do things within their own homes. Whacking a solar panel on the roof doesn't really shift the types of appliances or behaviours you have necessarily. It's a pretty clean win, but getting off gas does change things, and most notably it changes things in the kitchen. So, I think that the Victorian government deserves a huge amount of credit for not just rolling out this policy, which is consistent with its climate ambitions, but also just starting that conversation, because that's a conversation that we really need to have. My guess is that they were keen to start that conversation ahead of the release of the gas substitution roadmap, because if there are some more significant announcements about the rest of the network and the future of gas use across the broader building stock, it's probably best to kind of, get the ball rolling with this piece of news and maybe pick up the conversation with some of those broader implications in a few months' time. But as Frankie says, gas substitution roadmap day, get out the popcorn, team.
Look, a little birdie tells me that maybe there won't be all that much new analysis in there because the analysis was already out there, but that implies that the measures will be chunky things to get into the detail of. So I guess we'll see. But one final thought on this for me for now is, notwithstanding that this is a relatively early chunk of the gas transition decision making, on its face, just stop adding to the stock of network assets and appliances that are gas dependent. What do you think the odds are that it has a rather swifter effect in promulgating the idea that there is no future in residential gas use and brings about a faster wave of change in resi than on its face it strictly ought to? I have spoken to some businesses who supply kit who just don't see why anybody's going to buy stuff from them in the coming months. I'm sure that's not the case for everybody, but is there, I hesitate to say it, more to this than a spreadsheet and a timeline, but maybe a bit of psychology and animal spirits to how fast the resi gas transition happens?
I think there's a lot of inertia in the consumer market, and I think that will take some time to shift. I think probably the more significant implications will be for those product suppliers and indeed the trades, particularly the plumbers for whom this is their stock in trade, the installation and replacement of things like hot water systems. This is a pretty clear signal that, there's a direction of travel here, and it would behoove them to make sure that they have diversified their risk profile, if I can put it that way. They make sure that they have, a product line and in the case of plumbers, the ability to install heat pump hot water systems, for example. And that's going to play out in various ways across, the different technologies that utilise gas in homes, right? I think they'll be paying more attention than consumers, but the consumers will come, but they'll need a bit more of a nudge. And the thing that in my chats with various media outlets late last week, which was coming up again and again, is, well, what about the renters and what about the vulnerable households, the ones that don't have the capital at hand to kind of make that transition? It was really interesting how quickly that conversation shifted to that cohort, which is something that, we on this podcast have talked about many times when this topic has come up. It's something that has been exercising the mind of wonks in this space. The implications of the death spiral and folk being stranded on the gas network. We got there in like 3 seconds as soon as this became a topic in the public mind, which was remarkable, right? And so I think that one of the things that the Victorian government will need to have some sort of story around is if this is indeed the direction of travel and they back this initial move in with some more fulsome policy that goes to the existing building stock, is, how are we supporting the most vulnerable through this transition? Because they're going to get asked.
Yep.
Obviously, an all-electric home is much cheaper to run, but there is that upfront, cost to overcome to get the equipment in there in the first place. And so any advocate in this space worth their salt is advocating that sort of just transition be very much at the forefront of government's thinking, and making sure that when it comes to retrofits and upgrades of homes in particular, that we're focusing in on those vulnerable cohorts in the first instance.
All right. Well, I think that's a gas substitution corner for this episode, but if you want more of that gas-focused content, there's plenty of episodes in the back catalogue, episode 5, on that Infrastructure Victoria report, and a couple just in the last few episodes. We had the report on the future of gas from the European Academy Science Advisory Council back on episode 26. And of course, how do you solve a problem like my heater, Grattan's Get Off Gas Plan, which, by all accounts, based on last Friday, Victoria's getting started on.
You solve it by banning it, don't you? Isn't that the answer?
That's part of the answer, yes, David.
Does that make Dan Andrews the head of the nunnery? I'm not sure how this metaphor is going.
I think we should stop there before it gets too disturbing.
Shall we save ourselves by chatting about a report?
That sounds like a handy escape hatch.
Critical minerals are essential for the production of many clean energy technologies, including solar photovoltaics and batteries. And with deployment of these technologies skyrocketing, the critical mineral supply chain has been put under intense pressure. So, with supply constrained and prices spiking, governments around the world have been rushing to increase production, improve supply chain resilience by diversifying the location of extraction and refining activity, and address concerns around social and environmental impacts. It's a huge issue, which makes the International Energy Agency's inaugural Critical Minerals Market Review incredibly timely. The report provides both a quantitative account of the global state of play, as well as an assessment of how effectively the world is addressing the critical minerals challenge. Tennant, how are we doing?
Well, we're doing okay on a number of fronts, but must do quite a lot better. The IEA's got a big process now around critical minerals. They feel that they've put it firmly on the governmental agenda around the world, and they have got not only this market review, but they've got more analysis coming with deep dives on every critical mineral and extra projections. And they're hosting the first ever intergovernmental ministerial summit on critical minerals later this year. But on the questions that really animate people around critical minerals, are we getting enough to actually make the energy transition happen? And is there enough out there underground to make the transition happen? Are we all just totally vulnerable to whatever China decides to do on critical minerals? Is Australia, do we have big opportunities or not? And are we achieving them? Well, they're very big questions. The picture is mixed. I was encouraged and daunted in equal measure when looking at this. But which should we start? Maybe with the are we getting the stuff out of the ground fast enough? And the answer to that one is faster than ever, fast enough just about for a mediocre global level of effort towards net zero, not yet nearly fast enough to achieve the IEA's net zero scenario. The level of investment and production growth is tracking the announced policies by governments, the concrete things that they say they're going to do. It's not tracking the targets or the goals that they've announced, which is in a way not super surprising. The money for a mine or a processing facility it's a big sack of change, and you'd really want to be quite confident that the demand is there and the policies that support demand are there before you make that investment. But we're going quite fast, but not fast enough.
But the important thing to say about that, though, is that even though. What did you describe it as? Mediocre. The trajectory that aligns with announced policies. Like even to keep pace with that mediocre trajectory, exploration investment went up 20% in 2022. Yeah. The development of those resources up 20% in terms of investment in 2021 and another 30% in 2022. There is a massive ramp up just to keep pace with the current rate of activity. So that one of the questions that I was posing myself was, well, what if we did get a whole lot more ambitious? Would we be able to scale up even quicker?
Yeah.
Given what a heavy lift it is to just keep pace with what is not the most ambitious trajectory one could imagine.
There would be a lag, I reckon.
Yeah.
And the sooner that policies can, policies you can see the whites of the eyes of become ambitious enough and concrete enough to motivate very large private investment in very down-on-the-ground activities around all kinds of critical minerals, lithium, cobalt, copper, rare earths, lots more. The sooner we can get to that level of specificity, the better, because there is quite a lag between the idea and the implementation.
Did you both find it interesting kind of where the investment is more bullish in the market? I think one of the more interesting insights I read about, who's putting all the money in, it's very much driven by more kind of niche plays and venture capitalists being a lot more aggressive in this space compared to, I think they benchmarked some of the biggest kind of more diversified mining companies across the country that are being, a little bit more circumspect. So it'll be interesting to see whether there's more of a tipping point coming for those larger companies to go even harder, because you imagine with the benefit of incumbency, and potentially a lot of some of that infrastructure and systems in place, if they chose to go harder, perhaps that time frame could be a little faster for companies like that compared to all the new startups that are popping up.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought. One of the things that this report, is so worth your time, dear listeners, to have a leaf through. It is a very colourful 83 pages. There's a lot of arresting charts in it. That it's an easy 83 pages. But one of the things that it brought home to me is that for all the energy system transformative impact of critical minerals, they're also just minerals. This is a industry like other bits of mining. It's very cyclical. It is full of overcorrections. It is full of people getting a rush of blood to the head sometimes and being too slow off the mark at other times. Prices are bouncing around. They've been up, they're coming down. Will people stop the level of investment that we need to see because of the dip in prices is a fear that the IEA has. But if we're investing enough, prices won't be super high. I think the caution of those diversified majors is very understandable, and the risk taking by the pure plays and the venture capitalists could come a cropper. We need it to not come a cropper, but mining is a tricky sector.
We haven't actually talked about what minerals we're talking about yet. Should we call out some?
I'm happy to look it through the Rob Peru magic mirror and call out the names of favourite critical minerals out in the audience. I see lithium in several varieties. I see copper. I see
copper, the big incumbent.
Why are these important? Lithium is overwhelmingly growing due to electric vehicle battery demand. For everything that's happening in big batteries, stationary batteries, that is a small fraction of the car-driven growth. Copper. What's copper good for?
Wiring.
Absolutely. And we need rather a lot of wiring, including in electric vehicles.
Lots of wires.
Including EVs, but also other components of renewable energy, like generation technology and transmission as well, right?
Yeah. And cobalt for batteries, manganese for batteries, and rare earths for electric motors and a few other things besides.
Oh, and nickel.
Nickel for batteries. Batteries!
For batteries. Are we sensing a trend here?
Batteries.
So it is worth remarking that this enormous growth is, very much being driven by the advent of EVs and the growth of battery production, which I'm sure doesn't come as a surprise. But then when you look at the map of where all of these minerals come from across the world, I mean, that was one of the other really big eye-opening things in this report that I probably didn't clock the full extent of until I saw the reliance with which the totality of these supply chains are concentrated in a very few places.
Yeah. One place in particular.
The People's Republic of China.
Indeed. So I think since we're setting this up, I think it's one of the really important things to note is the impact that this spike in demand, particularly over the last few years, along with a whole bunch of other supply chain challenges, has had on cost of critical minerals and the way that's been flowing through to clean energy technologies. There's some great data in here about how, as we've discussed before, learning rates have resulted in a whole bunch of energy technologies dropping in cost. That's true for batteries, that's true for wind turbines, that's true for solar panels. And then you've seen this uptick in the last 2 or 3 years. One of the really interesting things that this report highlighted, which is kind of obvious if you think about it, but it's really useful to foreground in this context, is as learning rates increase, the proportion of the costs associated with the clean energy technology that is associated with materials goes up.
Yeah.
And that's exacerbated where you have these price spikes. So one of the things when we talk about the increased infrastructure costs associated with, hitting our targets for 83% renewables by 2030 or whatever it is, there's this global context from the pure materials point of view, which is feeding into that, right?
Yeah, and the turnabout in materials prices almost certainly doesn't change any of the major relativities of is the clean energy transition worthwhile, or what's the relative competitiveness of variable renewables and coal with carbon capture and storage, or nuclear or whatever. But it does mean that specific figures from previous projections of what was the cost of this or that major piece of kit, what's the cost of this wind farm going to be, and so on. Those things are going to be wrong. And of course, projections made this year using numbers like those in the IEA report for where minerals prices were last year, they're probably going to be wrong too, because at least some of these minerals are declining significantly in 2023 in price. That could turn around again, depending on what happens with the Chinese economy. But it's a very messy world for people who want a nice, clear, this is what it's going to cost you number. And it's a world full of opportunity for people who would like to say that somebody was not just wrong, but lying to you.
But going back to that, is investment in the critical minerals supply chain a good investment, or likely to be a good investment? It strikes me that the direction of travel on this is pretty clear, and obviously there's lots of highways and byways in the resources sector, and there's a lot of things that influence the viability of any particular investment. But this is a growing market, whichever way you look at it. I mean, just as you've both pointed out, the growth in battery demand is absolutely remarkable, right?
It's skyrocket.
Sales of EVs, I think, were sitting around 5% of new car sales a couple of years ago, and they're up around 14% now. Yeah. And that's before you get into some of the grid scale batteries and the other things that are sort of, froth on the top of the EV market. Batteries is an exciting space. And if you're, supplying critical minerals into the battery supply chain, you'd have to work pretty hard not to turn a dollar, I would have thought.
Yes, although, one of the interesting things this report raises as well is the number of potential futures for what kind of batteries are going to dominate.
That is interesting.
Into the future, and even more fascinating when you overlay the investment profile as well, because we talked about venture capital v established diversified mining funds, but what you're also seeing is car makers and battery makers seeking to firm up their supply chains by kind of having that shift from not just long-term offtake agreements with those mining companies, but directly investing in those mining companies themselves and buying assets and owning and controlling the mines. So you're seeing this, super interesting dynamic where you've got some of the largest battery manufacturers who, I think I clocked the was it CATL, I think,
yep,
which is a Chinese-based, the largest battery manufacturer in the world, and companies like BYD as well, electric car manufacturers, leaning heavily into this space. And so it'll be really interesting to see to what extent the decisions that those big companies make in terms of a bet on the kind of battery that their cars are going to have on the broader market, because you can see bets being had each way on sort of the different chemistries of batteries you could be looking at. And from the West, very much driven by perhaps wanting to favour the use of materials that maybe are less concentrated in places like China as well.
Yeah, the battery innovation picture is really interesting and complicated and nuanced. There's a lot happening in experimentation with different chemistries. Well, more than experimentation. There are major competing alternatives that are doing things like reducing the degree of reliance on cobalt as a metal that is both expensive, produced in conditions that arouse great doubts from ESG types and many others, mostly produced in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And there are ways to reduce that reliance, including through lithium iron phosphate batteries. Those in turn have new supply chain dependencies of their own, different ones. And then the proliferation of different chemistries will at least complicate the future for battery recycling, both because recyclers will need to deal with a wider range of chemistries and because some of those chemistries, if they are successful in getting rid of high-priced materials, will also therefore be a little more difficult to justify recycling on strict economics in the absence of market rules or regulations that support that recovery. So, the innovation is largely great. There's amazing things happening on capability as well as cost, but it's a lot to keep up with for investors, for recyclers, for users. It's going to be a very complicated space.
So there's a bunch of policy challenges for governments, right? So we've talked a lot about the market, but this is a very active space in terms of policy making. The IEA has tracked about 200, I think they said, policies that have emerged in the last few years focused directly on critical minerals, and they're variously grappling with these different challenges, right? Like there's the ESG stuff, and the report notes that the industry is getting better on the social front, reinvestment in local communities, gender diversity and the like. Those metrics are going in the right direction, but things like carbon emissions and waste and water use are either getting worse or at best flatlining. That environmental piece is a challenge for the sector. But then, as we've noted, just making sure that aggregate supply matches growing demand. And then the diversification piece is this critical concern of governments, I think, particularly in the West. This plays into the geopolitical tensions around China that sort of are impacting many parts of global policy.
Yeah.
And there's a whole bunch of governments that are very, very keen to ensure that there is greater diversity both in the supply and processing of critical minerals. They don't want to be as reliant on China as they currently are. And so you've got, whether it's the US with the Inflation Reduction Act, the EU's been playing in this space with some pretty proactive policy, Canada, Australia. There's a bunch of producers of critical minerals that are actually putting in export bans on the export of raw material. So forcing investment in their local jurisdiction to do some of that value adding. It's a really fascinating but also volatile space in terms of policy, right?
Yeah. I think if we were going to assess where Australia's at in that landscape, you'd have to say we've not done nearly close to what some of the bigger countries like the US and the EU have put in place. But then looking at that diversification question, what some of these countries are doing is looking at, well, you know, we're resource rich and we're mining the stuff, but then, you know, a lot of that invariably, and this is broadly across the supply chain, goes to that reliance on China, who really, they globally dominate the kind of the mid-level processing and refining of lots of these materials. So they are bulk importers of pretty much everything across the board. And then you look at, a country like Indonesia, I think, was one that they did make a point in this paper of seizing on, have introduced bans to, to stop the export of unprocessed, it's nickel, isn't it, out of Indonesia?
Well, they've done this for a few things, but nickel has been the big one in terms of impact so far.
And their industry is booming, right? Yeah,
it's the kind of policy that I think a lot of people in Australia would faint at the thought of. And look, I might be one of them, but they have clearly had both tremendous investment in the extraction side and in the processing side in the years since they introduced that policy. I don't know if it will wind up being, an unalloyed good for Indonesia, but it has achieved big things. And if you imagine, like, Australia banning the export of iron ore, That would be a big deal. I don't know that would be a good idea, but it would be one way to try to make the onshore iron processing with hydrogen dream happen. It might be taken as a slightly hostile action by China.
I don't know why you'd say that.
Yeah, not just China, but that's what our very near neighbour is doing for nickel.
I mean, we did touch on the fact that the opportunity for Australia is huge, but should we zero in just a little on that in terms of where our natural advantage lies, e.g. lithium?
We said it's huge, but I think we should say huge.
It's very, very big. We are the largest producer of lithium in the world, no? We dominate that market.
Yeah. We don't want diversification of lithium mining. We want to stay dominant.
That's right.
The lithium demand is going to go gangbusters on the medium term and the long term. And, of course, there'll be like swings and roundabouts in that because it's a commodity, but it's going to be very big and we've got a lot of it. And the question is, are we going to be big in the processing bit of it too?
Yeah.
And there's a great chart of the investment in processing and in refining. Australia accounts for 11% of the planned refining capacity to be added over the rest of this decade. And that's more than we have of the existing refining capacity. But China is half. Argentina a quarter, Chile a tenth, others 15%. So we are a bit player in the processing side, and maybe we could be very big.
Yeah, which sort of goes to the comparative policy analysis that's in this report, right? So you've got the US and Europe doing big things, as they tend to do, on a completely different scale to anything that Australia could contemplate. But when you take a look at what Canada, a much more comparable economy, not dissimilar in size and not dissimilar in terms of, a pretty significant resource base of a proportion of the economy, they've recently announced around $3.8 billion in support with all kinds of tax breaks for both extractive industries and also on the processing side. In this IEA report, they point to, around $140 million on the table via the Modern Manufacturing Initiative. But, there's been a bit of movement at the station, I understand, Tennant, in terms of those allocated funds, but the National Reconstruction Fund is coming to the table.
Yeah, MMI, so 5 minutes ago, but the National Reconstruction Fund, the NERF, the NARF, the NERF is the new hotness. There's a lot of money next to the name of the NERF, but it's finance, not grants. Yeah. And there's a real question mark how big a difference it's able to make operating in a near commercial manner to the economics of critical minerals refining projects that maybe have a bit of a cost competitiveness hill to climb compared to Chinese capacity.
Do I recall correctly that your friends at the Productivity Commission were out and about recently saying that all this critical mineral processing was for the birds and we should just focus on what we're good at and ship it overseas?
It sounds like a very PC sentiment. Mm-hmm. I don't have a Top Gun meme for that one yet.
The other policy intervention I'm really interested to track the evolution of globally, but also domestically, is around how we might invest in recycling and recovery of materials. And I'm actually fascinated to see the next iteration of analysis the IEA puts out, because they're talking about doing a much more detailed mapping of demand and supply. And what, a lot of what we've focused on here is about how quickly we can ramp up, extractive industries that dig new materials out of the ground. And I think it would be really interesting to get a sense of how much of this is already in circulation in our supply chains, how accessible it is from a recovery perspective, and what kind of investment we might put on the table to recover the material that's already out there.
Yeah.
That hasn't been a focus here domestically yet, although a couple of those big economies we touched on earlier, particularly the US and Europe, are definitely looking to have a focus. So wanting to promote that approach to circular economy as well, I think, is another really big lens through which we should be looking at all of this.
Real-time follow-up. This is from the Financial Review. Labor's battery dream to cost taxpayers more than it earns. Anthony Albanese's plans to establish a taxpayer-funded battery-making industry won't boost national welfare and entrenches a rent-seeking, a damning Productivity Commission report warns. This is from the 20th of July. We should learn the lessons of our protectionist past, according to the Productivity Commission. And it urges the government to focus on servicing US buyers of Australian commodities in response to the IRA, even if Washington's subsidies come at a significant cost to US taxpayers, whose incomes, Tennant and Frankie, will be lower as a result.
Yeah, they're pretty down on it.
Good old Productivity Commission.
Well, our dear listeners should go back and listen to that episode. We had thoughts about what the Productivity Commission had to say on climate policy.
The question is, if everybody is opening the spigot for eye-watering subsidies and then you're not, where does that leave you? If you're the purist in the corner, not supporting your local industries, not sort of pursuing a opinionated industry policy, where do you find yourself?
Sitting in a pile of virtue and feeling very self-satisfied, being subsidised, having your consumers subsidised by the hard-working, long-suffering taxpayers of America and China, but maybe with a pretty undifferentiated, vulnerable economy.
Yeah, and potentially at the back of the queue for all of the things that we need to do this transition.
Now, speaking of callbacks, is there a connection here to this nascent agreement between Australia and the Biden administration?
Yes.
The compact.
The compact.
Yeah, well, the most concrete, as we've talked about before, the most concrete bit of that seems to be exactly the level of access for Australian resource development to US money of various sorts. So I guess the PC is going to get part of that wish.
The US taxpayer is going to be even poorer because they're subsidising Australian-based projects.
They seem to be very enthusiastic about having access to stuff that is not from China, so maybe they will feel a harder to put into the spreadsheet glow of their own.
As always, we close out the show with one more thing, in which we all share something that is currently captivating our attention. Tennant, what have you got?
So I'm going to be naughty and have two things, but they are thematically linked in that at least one of them is nonsense and maybe both of them.
Listeners, you be the judge.
We're not moderating this.
You can judge too. I recently was lucky enough to go to Darwin to speak at the Developing Northern Australia conference, and I was talking about clean economy development opportunities and the question marks and uncertainties. Great conference. Darwin was lovely, particularly coming from a very grey and chilly Melbourne, although in Darwin they were all complaining about how cold it was. The thing that I want to note, though, is that there was a presentation at the conference from one of the major companies looking to develop the Beetaloo Basin gas fields, and they really lived down to the worst kind of stereotypes or suspicions of people on energy Twitter, in that they were presenting a picture of growing world gas demand all the way to 2050, Australian gas demand to be flat to 2050, showing all this gas that was going to be needed to replace the decline in southeastern Australian production, and therefore we were going to need Beetaloo gas to run combined cycle gas turbines to do a US-style coal to gas switch. It was a very contestable presentation. They were protested by some enterprising security pass photocopy holders who had snuck their way into the event and leapt up and shouted vociferously. But it was a presentation that needed some facts and figures to respond to it. So I had the chance to do that 24 hours later, unfortunately. So that's my first one. My second one that has maybe a higher chance of being accurate is the kerfuffle on the internet in the last few weeks, which may have been resolved by the time this episode goes to air, with the putative discovery of a room temperature normal pressure superconductor based on a couple of common substances, which is said by the South Korean research team who've promulgated it in a couple of papers in not super prestigious locations, that it will be civilization changing, and there's a bunch of people trying to replicate it as we speak. It may turn out to be nonsense, but if it doesn't, that'd be pretty exciting.
Tennant, what's a superconductor?
A superconductor is a substance that will conduct electricity with zero resistance and generate extremely powerful magnetic fields. And so if you had one, in fact, we do have superconductors already, it's just that they need to be chilled to near absolute zero. And even ones that need to be chilled only to like liquid nitrogen type temperatures are quite exciting. If we had one that would operate at room temperature, why, the sky's the limit. Cheap maglev trains, fusion reactors, hyper-efficient computers that didn't heat up when doing heavy computation. So many things could you do with room temperature superconductors. So while this one is, like, let's face it, it's probably not right, it's very exciting to think that it might be. So yeah. Watch this space.
Very cool. Frankie, nonsense or not?
Oh, I've got something very standard compared to Tenet, but it's exciting on the Australian climate policy landscape. So I'm hoping our summer uppers are going to be here for that. Less than a couple of weeks ago, we had an announcement from Chris Bowen, Climate and Energy Minister, that the government's cracking on with its plans for the economy-wide net zero strategy that we've, been hotly speculating might be on the cards for a little while on the pot. So that was very exciting. He announced that they're going to start developing plans for six different sectors, which would inform the strategy. So we're going to see sectoral plans, and this is, building on and then and going beyond what the government's been doing, I guess, since they came in last year. But there'll be plans for electricity and energy sector, and there's already obviously lots going on in that space. There'll be one for industry. Of course, the safeguard mechanism is a big feature there, but
plenty of other stuff going on there.
Well, plenty of other things needed as well alongside that. Very excitingly, the built environment will get its own sectoral strategy, and I've got a few ideas about what they might put in that one. And then other sectors include agriculture and land, transport and resources. And they've said that Minister Bowen's going to be jointly developing these with some of his cabinet colleagues. So, Ed Husick will partner up with him on industry and built environment. Murray Watt and Tanya Plibersek will work with him on agriculture and land, and then you've got Madeline King on resources and Catherine King on transport. So it's all happening. And the other, I think, thing that's worth mentioning here as well is the role of the Climate Change Authority in all of this, which are going to receive a bit of a commission or a reference from Parliament to help develop some of those pathways that'll inform the plans, and that the government's potential 2035 target is going to feature in that process too. So all of this, I think, to be delivered in some form by the end of 2024. So lots of work to be getting on with.
Lots indeed. Lots of fodder if one happened to have a podcast. Which
we trade in fodder.
Had the raison d'etre of summing up.
Everything's coming up LMSU.
All right. I have a very quick one on my other podcast, First Fuel. The latest episode is a great chat I had with electrification maven and a chap who happened to be the global keynote at this year's National Energy Efficiency Conference, Jan Rosenow, who is, of course, Director of European Programs at the Regulatory Assistance Project, co-host of the What Matters podcast, does all kinds of things. But before he headed back to the UK from the conference, I grabbed him for a chat, which covered the things that you would expect one would cover in a chat with Dr. Jan Rosenow, including the prospects for electrification and hydrogen in various sectors, KPIs for an effective national energy efficiency strategy. That seems relevant. And we also had an interesting extended sidebar on why Jan's sick of debates about climate targets and just reckons we should get on with doing something. So he's a delightful human being. If you didn't have the pleasure of hearing him in person at the conference, he is something of a superstar in the climate and energy space. So it's well worth looking up the First Fuel podcast feed and having a listen. And we will include a link, of course, in the show notes. So I would say that is our show for today. But Frankie, our listeners have been experiencing an extended state of anxiety, wondering what's going to happen when you have your baby.
Yes.
Are they going to have to put up with Tennant and I raving on at each other?
Well,
for extended periods.
Well, they will. But the thing that you should, worry a little less about is that they won't be on their own. I'm not going to leave them unsupervised. I wouldn't do that to summer uppers.
You are a humanitarian.
I'm really doing it for all of you summer uppers. Don't worry. Yes. Well, I am obviously keen and hot to trot back on the pod, but being realistic about how tiny humans need a little bit of time to, acclimatise to the world outside. That's not going to happen straight away, so I'll be taking a short break. But my role in this fabulous pod will be very capably handled by a friend of the pod. And I'm sure you'll all be delighted to know that the magnificent Alison Reeve, Deputy Director at the Grattan Institute on energy and climate, is going to be stepping into my spot while I deal with said tiny human. Very exciting.
Yeah, an eminence.
Absolutely.
We're delighted that Alison's going to be joining us on the podcast. I think you'll be with us for at least one or two more episodes, Frankie, before Alison joins us. But yes, she will continue to keep Tennant and I honest. And the question that the odd summer upper who has heard this news on the grapevine has been asking me is if Alison is going to take custodianship of shirt franking with Fronty in your absence.
That might be a bit much to ask. We might be stretching the friendship even before we stretch the T-shirt.
She's welcome to it if she wants it. But I reckon we might just retire temporarily. My favourite segment.
On hiatus.
Right. Okay, well, that's our show for today. We are on social media. You can come have a yarn with us on LinkedIn. There is the social network formerly known as Twitter. There's Threads. I'm even on Mastodon. There's all kinds of places to find us.
Yes.
How is your Threads adventure going, Tennant?
I did succeed in creating an account. That is all I have done. I am, instead of making a go of it in what is probably a perfectly fine new venue, for now I am like the band on the Titanic, playing Nearer My God to Thee as I slip gently beneath the waves.
All right. Well, anyway, you can come find us in one of those places. But you can also email us. Frankie, where should people be directing their emails?
Well, you should be sending us all your hot tips for papers we need to crack on with to mailbag@letmesumup.net and make them good suggestions, guys. Like, we've got a pretty impressive pile. So if you want to cut
As opposed
through
to the rubbish suggestions that you... What are you implying, Frankie?
I mean,
Look into your heart, dear listener. Think twice. Is this a bad suggestion?
that's right. Well, I mean, you know, like, we have put out there that there are certain features of papers that we're more inclined to respond positively to, i.e. length of paper. Said
Non-crapness.
non-crapness is a pretty standard kind of I don't see what's controversial about that, Luke.
You're bringing some of the trademark Muscovich spice, just to remind listeners of what you bring to the podcast, the value you add.
That's right. Don't you forget it. Not here.
All right. So, yes, send us papers, but you can also visit our website, Tennant.
You can at www.letmesumup.net, and you can find the results of previous consideration of oh so many papers, yet always ever more, in past episodes. The back catalogue is at your fingertips for all of your past and future presidential briefing needs.
As of today, 30 episodes.
Yeah.
All right. So, go there. There's episodes. But in the meantime, for Frankie Muscovich and Tennant Reid, I'm Luke Menzel. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon. How'd you go with Alison on Friday? I guess you talked to Alison, Tennant?
We both did, me more, and it was a very fun time and good for dynamic, but I don't think we made tremendous logistical progress.
I think I was late.
She's going to fit right in.
And they were like, we've just been talking shit. And I'm like, okay. And then we chatted for another 5 minutes. And Tennant and I had to go.
She's passed the trial.
That's right.
It's Veep, continuity and change.
It was the test she didn't know she was sitting.